Okay, so we're here with Ethan Gutmann in Budapest to talk about investigative journalism, his life, and his investigation on the Chinese or organ harvesting. So first of all, thanks a lot for taking your time. And before we talk about journalism or investigative journalism and even China, please talk a few minutes about your background. So where were you born?
Right.
What was your upbringing, and so on?
Not that interesting, really. I mean, I was born in Chicago in 1958, and my parents were psychologists. We moved around a bit in the Midwest, and also I really consider Vermont my real home. Vermont, out in the mountains. I'm a country person, country guy. But I did get to travel a lot with my parents as a kid, all over the third world, which has helped me a lot in what I do. In a sense, what psychologists do and what an investigative reporter or a human rights investigator does is very similar. You're trying to help. You need honesty. You need candor. You need to establish what's real and what's not. Right. At the same time, because I had this experience with the third world, I'm very comfortable. I was very comfortable coming to China, which wasn't exactly third world, but even back then when I was living there, it more or less was, or it had some ads. I think those things had a big impact. I learned from my father, watching him interview people, how to show patience, how that people want to tell you the truth. But it may take them a lot of time. They may have to tell you a lot of bullshit before they actually get down to what's really important. And I saw that he had that patience. It's almost like a seduction process. You kind of back off when you feel that you're pushing somebody too much. This was very important when I was interviewing Falun Gong, because most of these people were refugees from labor camps, and they'd gone through horrible, unthinkable experiences. They were damaged in some ways. And it was very, very difficult for them to even know what was exactly true in some cases. They'd have to really go deep inside to get to that. It's not an easy process.
Was religion part of your upbringing?
No, not really. Actually, not, but I've been working around religious people one way or the other for many years. And I'm very comfortable with religious People. I don't have a difficulty with them. I often feel I wish I sort of had that gene, the religious gene. I don't have it. So,
But there has to be, I'm asking about religion because there has to be some sort of your empathy and for your caring of those in need. So what's the source of
I
that?
got a little bit of that from my mother. I think she was a very empathetic person. Maybe she wasn't always the most effective person, but she, as a psychiatrist, she really cared, and that empathy transformed the process. Probably made it much more successful. I saw some of the letters from her patients. They were amazing. Thank you for bringing some light into my life. This kind of thing. It's really highly emotional, and she had an amazing ability that way. And to some extent, I could kind of fake it, just watching her. But the thing about faking something is, after a while, it becomes true. Or it can become true. And I think sometimes that's sort of what happened to me with the Falun Gong issue. I did not start out to do an investigation on organ harvesting. Kilgore and Matus had already done one in 2006, a very effective study called Bloody Harvest. I was more interested in doing a comprehensive history of the conflict between the Chinese state and Falun Gong. I thought there were incredible stories here. People who've been to the gates of hell and come back, right? You want to get to those stories. Over time, I found myself getting more and more sympathetic to many of the people I interviewed. And I found myself, that empathy helped me. It helped me to get the real story. It helped because I would show the patience to wait. Often, people coming out of China are very used to propaganda. They've grown up with it. They're possessed by it. They're inundated with it. It's part of them. The tendency, if you're coming out of China, is to, and you have a Western reporter like me, is to want to spin them. to give them propaganda, counter-propaganda to maybe perhaps to the Chinese state, but propaganda nonetheless. I can't use propaganda. It's not effective. I can't tell an interesting story with propaganda. So often I would have to wait them out. But part of the waiting out process was I had to develop a kind of almost a love for the person sometimes, especially if they were very tough. Often the people who survived and came out of the labor camps alive and got to the West were unusual. Wang Yuji springs to mind. She was a very, very tough woman, extremely tough. Fought prison guards, screamed at them. They got to the point where they would put on paper bag masks so she couldn't see her faces. They couldn't see the face. Why? Because she was so effective. She was created such a conflict within the system. She was tough to interview, but the trick was to get to her inner life, what was really important to her. And she started telling me her dreams. Here's where the two things come together, the psychology and the investigative reporting, because it is true that sometimes your mind is like a computer. It is all night long. We say we'll sleep on it, we'll think about a problem, we'll sleep on it. What we mean is our mind is this computer which is going through all the iterations, all the possibilities, even the wilder ones. So in her case, she was a candidate for organ harvesting, but her conscious mind did not realize it. It refused to recognize it. She was in a hospital, she was being tested extensively, but she had a dream where there were two guys from the 610 office standing there in lab coats looking at her, and then pieces of meat fell out from underneath their lab coats. That was the dream. Now, if there's can you think of a clearer dream about organ harvesting than that? I can't. Honestly, I can't even come up with a better image. It's like something out of a Hollywood horror movie, right? But that dream exposed that her subconscious mind had examined this possibility and said, this is possible, even probable. And in fact, it was. And in fact, they would have harvested her if her health had been better.
Okay, before we go into a bit deeper to organ harvesting, another personal question. How do you personally deal with the stories you hear? It's unavoidable that these stories affect you. At least I would think.
They do, but I mean, I'm just a normal human in many ways. And over time, I think I was working with my research assistant, and we'd interviewed so many, I guess 45 or something people from labor camp. And at one point I was sort of expressing something like, oh, here's another story. And he sort of said, Ethan, I think you're ready to write your book. Basically, you're starting to get a little callous. So there was a tendency, it goes both ways. There was a tendency you start hearing the same story over again, and that's very reinforcing for your research. But it's also true that you can both go a little callous on these things at times. I guess what I'd describe as this. When somebody has attacked my work publicly and said, oh, isn't this a cult or something like that, is Falun Gong, isn't it a cult? You'll see, I can get pretty cross with them. I can get pretty tough. And the reason I can say that probably one of the very few outsider reporters who can say this, is because I was embedded with Falun Gong. There was no other way to do the research. I took out a room in a home which was filled with Falun Gong in Fort Lee, New Jersey. I had a little bedroom. I had a little, there was a copy of Juan Falun next to me. This was okay. Nobody questioned really why I was there after a while. I got up in the morning and people would plot strategy and what we're going to do and how we have to react to what the Chinese Communist Party has just done. I did that every day. I hung out. That was not a cult. There was too many arguments for it to be a cult. These people were constantly disagreeing. People would go off and do their own thing. They didn't have to submit it to some sort of higher authority. So when I hear sort of misconceptions or just bad information, or if you like the stupid expression fake news that's come from the Chinese Communist Party, I stomp on it. Okay, I come down really hard. An example, recently I was at a conference small conference in Westminster. And one of the ladies there, I don't want to say her name, she's a friendly, we've had a cup of coffee since then, said, oh, well, Falun Gong, surrounded Zhongnan High on April 25th, 1999. Well, in fact, they didn't surround Zhongnan High. They were told to surround Zhongnan High. They showed up to go to the National Appeals Office. Now, this may seem like a small thing, a historical detail, but it's not. It meant that they were going to the only legal place that Falun Gong could go to, okay, to get their brothers and sisters released from captivity and, and a terrible persecution which was beginning. So I think you have to me, when I hear somebody say that, and I know that I've interviewed 25 people who were there that day and have given me information about soldiers with bayonets at the ready and how prepared the Chinese Communist Party actually was for this event, and how they lined them up along the street, and they had cameras set up a little bit like yours all the way down the street and around the corner, so they could do facial recognition. You see, it's very hard. It's harder for me to hold my temper, and I suppose that's a side of it where I am. I don't consider myself an activist, but I am an activist for truth, and in this case, the facts that I put in the book, I thought very hard about them. I was sober when I wrote it, and and they're real, and I've backed up everything I say. I stand by every word I wrote. It took me a long time to write for that reason.
Okay, let's talk about the big picture of organ harvesting. When did it start? How well is it organized? Does it have a central commanding entity, so to speak? So please give us a broad picture of the whole phenomenon.
What you're giving us, these are really good questions and very and questions I thought a lot about. I will give you my best answer. I really can't do better than that. Look, there's a lot of information we're missing, a lot of gaps. But as far as my research goes, and it's pretty much mostly field research, organ harvesting of political dissidents, organ harvesting of prisoners is back there in the 80s. And it wasn't common, but it was happening. It was mainly kidneys. And this was just people get shot and they remove the organs. So it's fairly standard all the way up into 92, 94. Right around there, we start to see the first presence of live organ harvesting. Now, it may have happened in other areas of the country, but where I'm picking it up is in Xinjiang, in what the Uyghurs call East Turkestan, the northwest of China, which has always been used as sort of China's illicit laboratory, in a way. Now, 94, you pick that up. 95, we have Enver Tohti actually performing live organ harvesting on an execution ground in Xinjiang. What we don't have necessarily is political or religious prisoners of conscience being harvested, which is my interest here.
So please define live organ harvesting.
Live organ harvesting is fairly simple. It's the person is shot, or one way to do it is you shoot the person in a non-lethal way, but it's Enver's operated as somebody who's been shot on this side of the chest, the opposite side of the heart. It's enough to send the body into profound shock, although his body did squirm. The man actually squirmed when he made the first incision, but was too weak to resist his scalpel. That's one way to do it. It's a very crude way. The other way to do it is to administer various drugs. Usually not, you don't want to put the person fully under. You don't want to, you don't want them to completely lose consciousness, so often it's a kind of sedatives. The reason for that is because if the organ is put into sort of suspended animation through drugs, then it won't take as well. It'll be sluggish in the new body. And that sluggishness may cause a resistance in the new body, and the body may try to reject it. So this is all about trying to get the new host not to reject this organ. And so the key thing, of course, is matching blood types and matching tissue types and so forth. But there are these other aspects of it. It has to be truly fresh, just like flowers. You cut flowers and you under running water, don't you? I mean, this is anybody's learned not to do that sees their flowers wilt. But if you can keep that constant contact with life, okay, in this case, If you can do that operation very quickly, extract the organ, put it in the new host as fast as possible. That's ideal. If you don't use anesthesia, full anesthesia, that's ideal. Originally, people put that out there, and that was sounded so improbable, but it's not that improbable. In fact, we've seen scientific studies about this. In fact, Wang Lijun, maybe the most famous policeman in all of China, was running a center, public security bureau center, where they were harvesting organs, and he was given an award for coming up with methods for preserving a lethal injection method, essentially a lethal injection method which didn't destroy the organs. So this is, technical problem. But your question was let me go back on your question for a second.
So, given the size of China,
yeah.
what you're saying, the system needs an incredible amount of logistics. So, how is it organized?
No, but here's the development. Okay, so the development is this. In 1997, you have the Gulja incident, a little uprising in China in the Uyghur section. And after that, you get the first cases that we know of in Urumqi of political prisoners being harvested for their organs on a very small scale, only about 6 people initially, on behalf of high-ranking Chinese cadres. All right, so right from the beginning, this is linked into the Chinese Communist Party, and it's for their special use. And in fact, then we know that another 6 came, and they got their organs as well. We have this on good authority of a doctor who actually took the blood tests from the political prisoners. He is in Europe, and he has family in China, and he does not want to come out, though he might come out someday and talk about it more directly. The point is that right from the beginning, it's a specialized program for the Communist Party. Over time, that changes. And why does it change? Well, in part because of Falun Gong, in part because the supply suddenly changes. So we get the biggest roundup of religious or political dissidents since the Cultural Revolution with Falun Gong, starting in about end of 1999, but really going into 2000 is when it starts to hit its stride. And by the end of 2000, we start getting the first cases of Falun Gong practitioners in captivity. And we're talking huge numbers here at this point, maybe a couple of million. All right, they're actually starting to dominate the Laogai system. Then you start getting cases of Falun Gong practitioners being given blood tests, but not just blood tests, actually a series of physical tests which are clearly aimed at their retail organs. Okay, anything you can sell. So that would be corneas, for example, because it's a tissue. It's not an organ, it's a tissue. Yeah. But it can be sold to somebody. And so they would, the classic example I always use from that period is a woman, and several women describe this independently, is they are given, the doctor spends a long time looking into their eye with light, but never does a peripheral vision test, never does a focus test, nothing. All right? So there's a clear interest in the corneas because you can extract them, and that's it. He doesn't care about eyesight. That involves brain. Eyesight doesn't matter. The other thing, of course, is livers, kidneys, and so forth, and eventually hearts become more popular over time. Now, these tests are initially comprehensive, and in fact, they're sort of fake to look like regular medical tests. But even then, the Chinese expose their nervousness about this because often they'd have a single public security bureau officer accompanying a Falun Gong woman to their exam. That's incredible. I mean, why would you have an armed guard for some Falun Gong auntie from the provinces? I mean, she's not going to grab the scalpel and start carving things up. They know that. Well, the reason you're doing that is because they knew they were doing something terrible. Okay, they were analyzing these people for destruction. At the same time, how did that work? Well, we don't know. We don't know the exact mechanism of the system. What we do know is that those tests begin to show up fairly dramatically at the end of 2000, 2001, and at the same time we start seeing a rise in liver transplants and kidney transplants, particularly in liver, which is most significant because, of course, you can live without a single kidney, but you can't live without a liver. So we know that these people are being killed to order, essentially.
Who's on the customer side?
Let's go back to the system for one more second. There's 2 competing theories about this system. One is that it was a kind of that there's some document out there which essentially is a final solution document, like the Holocaust. And we do have those documents from the Holocaust. I don't believe there is such a one in the Chinese. There may be one in the Chinese, in Beijing somewhere. I don't believe we'll find it, if it ever existed. And I think that's partly because China is somewhat different. It is a more capitalist place than Nazi Germany was. It is not quite as tightly controlled in a funny way. So what starts with the military hospitals, and it's all military hospitals initially who are doing these tests. It's all military doctors, and it's all, and they're clearly they're the ones responsible for starting to eliminate Falun Gong. Spreads to the civilian hospitals. And it starts spreading at around the same time that the organ harvesting starts spreading to other populations. Tibetans, house Christians. For the first time, they start showing up at the hospitals. They're taking entire busloads of monks, Tibetan monks, driving them for, 15 hours to a hospital. They didn't have very good hospital facilities in Lhasa. So they're taking them to state-of-the-art facilities and testing their blood and testing them for organs. Exact same tests. I've spoken, the interviews come from a different language. They don't talk to Falun Gong. Falun Gong and Tibetans barely communicate, but it's the same test. So that is the most persuasive aspect of this investigation in many ways, was seeing it show up in different groups. And as for Eastern Lightning, we just simply know because the Falun Gong practitioners, and only the Falun Gong practitioners and Eastern Lightning, were being given tests in labor camp. So these were the two considered the two most troublesome groups. Now, the civilian hospitals get involved, and then it becomes a very big business. And today we look at it and we say, well, the military hospitals are still very big in organ harvesting, but something like Tianjin Central, Tianjin Central Hospital, which is not a military hospital, it's a civilian hospital, is doing, the biggest numbers as far as we can tell. They were doing about 5,000 transplants per year the last time we looked. Now, does it matter that there's a big document there? Does it matter? I don't know. I would say that if these things can form organically, I think it matters to people who want to blame this on a single man, that is Jiang Zemin. I don't believe that. That is not my experience of China. My experience of China was the Communist Party is a culture. It is a culture. It makes decisions. There's a lot of groupthink involved in decisions. The Jiang Zemin may have pushed it particularly, but certainly PSB members were involved, and many other members of the Politburo were not put up no resistance to this.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you're saying that a possible genocide is in connection with the organ harvesting business?
I think one of the complexities of this whole investigation is that people want to put it into a mold. They want to see it as, well, okay, it's like the Holocaust. Well, no, it may not be exactly like the Holocaust. It's different. They want to see it as the Spanish Inquisition. Well, it has qualities of the Spanish Inquisition. After all, if somebody was Falun Gong, and if they converted fully and rejected Falun Gong on tape, on camera, ratted out their friends, and said, I love the Communist Party and I'll never practice that horrible thing, that horrible cult-like activity again, they could go free. Much like the Spanish Inquisition could take a Jew and if they converted fully to Christianity and they kept it up, they could continue to live in this society. But there are differences. There's a capitalist imperative here too. These hospitals are making serious money. We're estimating about $8 to $9 billion a year in organ harvesting. This is very irresistible, and it's particularly irresistible if you have organ tourists coming from abroad, because they pay about 10 times as much for an organ as a Chinese person does. Now, there's plenty of Chinese people who need organs. There's a huge market there. But if you get a Japanese person, there are cases where it's $1 million and a half for an organ, okay, because they don't like to negotiate very much, and the Chinese exploit that. The profit motive gets involved here, and it blurs what we see as the usual picture. The Holocaust. nobody could figure out what to do with these bodies. What they tried making soap out of them, skin and lampshades. I mean, these kinds of things. These are not really profitable. They pull the teeth and you take the gold from the teeth, yes. But the bottom line is these bodies were relatively useless. That's not true now. No, the average body, if it's harvested correctly, somebody like you, not me, but it would be worth about 300,000 US. Okay, maybe 300,000 euros even. I mean, it's approximately that. If it's harvested absolutely correctly, it's a healthy person, reasonably young. You know, every each lung can be worth 80,000 euros easily. So I think we have to examine that as well. What you have is I've never tried to sort of simplify this process for people. That was not why I go to the trouble to write a book. It takes me 7 years to write a book, is to simplify it into a simple soundbite. It is not. This thing, in my mind, grew organically. Now, organically, yes, but it also grew out of systemic problems in the Chinese Communist Party. It grew out of a feeling, and I spend most of the time in my book trying to answer the why the Chinese Communist Party would go after Falun Gong the way they did. And to me, that's a very important question that people always ask. And I think it's a reasonable one, and I don't come up with the same answer. It changes over time.
Okay, so it's hard to tell if the main motive is business or socio-economic
Both
problems.
can be true. I mean, look, this is the problem, is we have this tendency in the modern world that is incredible to me. I mean, you're an intelligent person, I'm an intelligent person. We both know that we can be influenced by many things simultaneously, or that one action can solve several problems, to kill two birds with one stone. So in this case, you're making money and you're getting rid of an enemy of the state. Okay? Something that the Chinese want done, the Chinese Communist Party wants done anyways. The only question to me, but in answer to your question, is this centrally run? Yes, it is centrally approved, okay? Not centrally run so much, but approved, absolutely understood on the highest levels that this is going on. There's no doubt about that.
Can you give me a breakdown of the customer side? You mentioned Japan, but where do customers come?
Japan, but it's never been our major interest. I wouldn't say Kilgore made us. Maybe we're the sort of primary investigators. It is organ tourism has never been our major interest, and there's a reason for that. It's partly because Kilgore and Matus did a terrific study very early on, where they went into Canadian hospitals and talked to people who'd been gotten an organ in China. The truth is, organ tourists are kept at arm's length from the process. They never know where they're really getting the organ. I, for example, interviewed a guy in Birmingham who'd gotten a kidney in Xi'an Military Hospital. I said, "Where did it come from?" He said, "I don't know. I'm sure it was okay, but I don't." But when I asked him again, he said, "Well, I don't really know where it came from." And I said, "Well, why didn't you ask?" He said, "Because if I had, they would have shown me the door." So we have to consider that as well. That they're kept at arm's length. They don't really have a lot to add to the process in many ways. And it's also not, trying to go after organ tourism is ridiculous in a way. There's a sort of fellow out there, Campbell Fraser, who sort of constantly has made it his big thing to say, I study the dark web, and they blindfolded me in Egypt and drove me to a place where I could get a new organ and so forth. It's like, well, that's fine. That's all exciting. And, maybe, it's exciting to put on a burqa when you're in Afghanistan too, I suppose. But the truth is, this isn't dress up. The organ brokers don't wear trench coats. It's called Google. That's the organ broker. You just type in those words, help, I need a kidney. Put into your device, and or help, I need a liver, even better. And you will, within the next first 20 hits, you'll find a discussion board of some kind. And that discussion board will quickly lead you to Tianjin Central Hospital in China, okay? The only people who seem to rely on organ brokers are the Japanese, again, because of this cultural aversion to negotiating, especially the Chinese. They hate it.
You've mentioned that the donation, so to speak, the donation side is horrific, but the process of the recipient, is that highly professional? Are they well equipped in these military hospitals?
I'm not really equipped to say. I'm not equipped, I think, to say something definitive about that. I've heard both arguments. One is that it's the usual slipshod. A lot of things in China are done in a sort of slipshod way, and that's certainly true. It is also true that they are, according to our statistics, which are that they're doing about 60,000, at least 60,000 transplants per year. They actually have much more experience with it than any other country at this point. And they try out different techniques that are unusual, and they almost guarantee a live donor. How can that not be an improvement? I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but truth is truth. I suppose if somebody is really desperate or desperately looking to save their mother's life or something, I suppose they should look at China. The problem for them is the ethical dilemma, is that they are probably condemning an innocent person to death. This is not we're not talking about criminals here mostly. We're not talking about somebody who's killed an entire family and then come back and killed the baby. We're talking about somebody who, maybe a woman who handed a leaflet out on the street. A pregnant woman. I mean, these things are absolutely possible and probable. We're talking about a Uyghur male, maybe 17 years old, who went out and shook his fist in the air and said, Allah Akbar, in one moment. This is what we're talking about. A Tibetan monk. This is a human rights catastrophe. It is not in terms of numbers. No, I think it's a couple 100,000 Falun Gong have been harvested. I wouldn't venture a guess on Uyghurs and Tibetans, though certainly it's much less. Although clearly the Uyghurs are going to be catching up and maybe surpassing Falun Gong if things continue on the current trajectory. But the point is, we have not seen medical corruption like this since the Holocaust, since you had forced sterilization of that nature, experiments on twins and all the rest of it. We haven't seen medical experimentation. Unit 7-1, we've seen it with the Japanese side a little bit. But to see it on this vast a scale, this is really, this is horrific, and I think David Matas said it's a new form of evil on this planet. I can't disagree with that.
Okay, well, obviously, to deal with the Communist Party is virtually impossible, but dealing with European and North American governments about regulations, because what law enforcement officials usually say, that if you can't stop the providing side, then try to control the customer side.
No. I think there's some truth in that, although there is enough money in the Chinese side to keep this thing going. Even if they pay 10 times less, you can make up for it by volume, which apparently China's been doing. I mean, they did put in regulations after Bloody Harvest was published, saying that they were going to stop all foreign organ tourism. Of course, that's not true. Countless reports have come out about foreign organ tourists going over to China. It happens all the time. But as an ethical matter, yes, of course, it's the first thing any state should do. And the only states which can claim they've done it, to put regulations in that have really genuinely stopped people from going to China for organs, are Israel was the first, then Italy, then Taiwan, most remarkably, I'd have to say, and finally Spain. All of these countries had something to lose. In the case of Taiwan, something very, possibly even their freedom or something like that. I mean, you've got missiles aimed right at you. All of them had something to lose. All of them took the bold decision to make a stand. None of them paid a serious political consequence, as far as I can tell, and that's really because the Chinese understand, they know that they're guilty in this case. So it's not one of these things where they can really get their dander up about it, and they don't really want to draw attention to the issue.
What did Israel do? So how does such a regulation look like in detail?
Regulation in there, it's very specific from specific countries and different from different countries. They go at different aspects. In Israel, they have an HMO system, a health maintenance organization system, and it's a very good system actually. The HMO system actually paid for people to go to China to get an organ. And a doctor, a surgeon, a heart surgeon, Jacob Levy, discovered this. Now, Jacob Levy is a kind of a bit of a figure in Israel, partly because his parents were in the camps, in the concentration camps. They're survivors. And so when he came out and said, this is outrageous, I have a patient who just went to China to get a heart transplant on a specific date at a specific hour, as if, how do they do that? I mean, what do they do? Arrange a car accident? Give me a break. So he started questioning this. He read Kilgore Matus, eventually read my stuff, and he's become a very active member in this. But he just came up with a law that said HMOs can't pay for this. Now, you can say, well, that's not comprehensive. It doesn't keep everybody in Israel from going. But Israel's a small country, and they can keep track of this stuff. And according to him, no one from Israel has gone to China since. It was a very big public issue. The Israeli, there was a lot of fear because the software industry in Israel has huge support from China, investment support. They were very worried about losing that support on a pillar industry in Israel. But they went ahead and did it, and they couldn't. And the reason why they did it was because of the Holocaust connection. It was that simple. They could not see themselves as being responsible for this kind of, in any way, helping to see this kind of genocide taking place. So, in Taiwan, completely different story. Taiwan passed a law ultimately saying the doctors couldn't facilitate anyone going to China for an organ transplant, and if they did, they could be liable. They could go to jail. They could lose their license. They'd be finished. That was a powerful law, different way of handling it. I'm sure some people from Taiwan still slip over. I don't doubt it for a minute. But it was an incredibly gutsy statement from them. And why did they do that? Well, because Dr. Ko, the current mayor of Taiwan, my book became a very, very big political issue in his campaign for mayor, because I quoted an interview which he tried to deny, where he said that he was offered Falun Gong organs for sale back in 2005. This is before Kilgore Matus, anything like that. In other words, he's looking around to see if there's a possibility of patients from the clinic that he was associated with coming over to China. They were anyways. And he was sniffing around to see if there was a good price or if it was at least reasonable condition. Were these people drug addicts that they were being harvested? And they said, no, they're not drug addicts. They're not even criminals. They're just Falun Gong. They don't drink. They don't smoke. They practice this very healthy Qigong. We'll give you a very good price if you come. If your people come over. And he confessed this to me in an interview, and I wrote it up in my book. And then that book became a very, very big issue in Taiwan. Now, did he confront the fact that No, he tried to distance himself from the interview and so forth. But he made a mistake. He said, had done the right thing. Because the interview had been off the record, I wrote up the account as best I understood it, and I sent it to him way before I published the book and said, is this right? Is there anything wrong with this? Please tell me. He comes back and says, the story seems okay. That's him. And then I said, well, actually, could I use your name? And he said, for what I say, I can be responsible. And then finally, as I got close to the book, I said, could I use your picture as well, along with the story? And that's the picture in the book. So he did try to distance himself, but ultimately people, I think, in Taiwan realized that politicians fib a little bit, big deal. But I think they realized this was something really bad, and they made a decision to cut that off at the pass. And since then, it has been a significant decision. As for Italy and Spain, I think David Kilgore and David Matus could speak to that much more effectively. They're much more involved in those particular negotiations.
Okay, final question. What are you working now?
I was hoping to get out of the organ harvesting investigation business. I really was. And in fact, if you go on the web, you'll see an artifact of that. I did a very good podcast on electromagnetic pulse and the North Korean capability of launching a devastating attack on America. And that's an hour and a half long podcast. If anybody feels like listening to it, it's fantastic, actually. And I'm good at that. I can do all kinds of investigative reporting. But the truth is, Beijing is still doing this. And even if I'm getting older and would like to do other things in my life, maybe that's just not the way my life turns out. You know, I thought they'd stop. Now I'm looking at this Uyghur situation, which is deteriorating. We see 17 million Uyghurs were over the last year were tested, DNA and blood tested. That means
17 million.
17 million men, women, children, babies, every single Uyghur. That blood testing is compatible with tissue matching. We see 500,000 to 1 million Uyghurs, very similar numbers to what Falun Gong was, and in detention at any given time. This has happened over the last 4 months, 5 months. They've had this rush program to build all these re-education centers. And finally, we see them building crematorium, 9 crematorium. The first one just opened, and they hired 50 security guards, which is a crazy number for a crematorium. It's just a place where you take dead bodies and essentially vaporize them, okay, expose them to extremely high heat. That's all it is. But they need 50 security guards. There's something really, really wrong with that picture. And the fact that Xinjiang is completely surrounded and no reporters can get in is very disturbing.
Yes, you mentioned before the interview that an average crematorium would need about 1 or 2 security guards.
Yeah, maybe 3 or 4 because it's China. You know, you always want to give people extra jobs and labor's cheap. These people are being paid $1,200. That number still sticks in my mind. $1,200 in China is a lot of money. $1,200 US, a lot of money for that region of the country. So these are not low-level people. They're talking about a sophisticated operation. So yes, events are pulling me back in. The fact that
And sorry, what's the source of that information that they're hiring 50 security guards
that
for
was
the
from Hoja. I can't. It's hard to even pronounce her name. There's a reporter named Hoja Hoya at. She's Uyghur at the Uyghur RFA, Radio Free Asia, and she actually called me with that information because we sometimes work together, and I was stunned by it. And the other information about the 17 million tests, that actually started with Human Rights Watch, who's never even been friendly to this issue. But these are unmistakable signs of something taking place. As for the 1 million to 500,000, that is commonly recognized now. In fact, the numbers sort of settled around 800,000 in detention right now. That all those numbers are extracted from PSB websites and reports that they put out internally. I mean, you can see them. The Chinese are kind of sloppy about these things sometimes.
Okay, one more question. What do they have to lose? So everybody has a weak spot. What is the Communist Party afraid of?
This is such a good question, and you're absolutely the central question in explaining why I'm still doing this. You see, there really is. I don't like to spend a lot of time harping on the Chinese Communist Party is so evil or this bad or something like that. That's for other people to talk about. I don't even like to define China as good or bad. That's not my issue. People make up their own minds. Look at the facts, make up your own minds. Look at people's actions. Look at Falun Gong actions, make up your own mind. Are they evil? Did they do bad things? I don't care what they say that much. I care about what people do. But if you look at the actions, what you see is a pattern in China that is a pattern that we've seen before. And this one is not like the Holocaust, where there's a mismatch or something. This is central. When Stalin began his programs against rich farmers in kulaks in Ukraine, did he intend to kill every kulak from the beginning? Maybe not. But as time went on and enough of them were dead, did he then have to destroy the evidence? Yes, he did. That meant destroying entire families. It meant destroying people who had worked for those families. That's what led to the massive starvation. That's what led to, the slaughter of millions and millions of kulaks in Ukraine. It's one of the worst crimes in history. And it was all to cover up an initial crime. This is very much a Marxist method of, you eliminate the problem, you eliminate the people. You do it thoroughly, you do it completely. If I were a surgeon in China who had performed thousands of extractions, I would not rest easy at night, because very likely I could be eliminated too. So I think that's what you have to consider here. With the Falun Gong problem, it isn't, at this point, I doubt Xi Jinping cares. about Falun Gong. For all I know, he's even tried out the exercises and thinks they're just fine. The issue for him is that he has to make sure this problem never shows up again. And the best way to do that is to rid the world of Falun Gong, as far as he's concerned.
Yes, but with today's world of economic interconnectiveness, I'm sure that China has a lot to lose. So they could.
Where's the law? See for yourself. What, if 4 countries ban organ tourism? Okay, I agree with you. Actually, I agree with the premise of your question. Rationally, I agree with it. Okay? Rationally, China's road to riches is not through organ harvesting, it is through pharmaceuticals. Absolutely. Okay? Big pharma. Okay? They can build their own FDA, which can approve drugs much faster than the West can. They've got genius scientists. Why shouldn't they be flooding the world with their drugs? But they can't, because they can't seem to let go of this, because they have to wipe out this problem. And they don't know of another way to do it. So with the Uyghurs, well, there are other possibilities of other ways to do it, and that may come up. But we see the problem is that organ harvesting has already infected the world. It doesn't matter what the Transplantation Society may go to China and go to every banquet and say nice things about China and come back and say nice things to the papers about China, and they often do, saying, oh, China's reforming, they had some problems, but now it's a reputable state. The Vatican can hold conferences saying, oh, China's kind of a bulwark for morality in organ harvesting. I mean, there's crazy things that are being said. But do you think the average doctor out there buys it? No, they sort of go, wait a minute, I've heard something else at the same time. And it's not from disreputable sources. I've heard it from the New York Times that this is plausible now. Okay? That's the shift. It is the shift that took place in 2016. That was the big year when suddenly it's an amazing thing to experience a tipping point. I've never experienced before in my life when the common knowledge, the common acceptance of whether something's true or not, tips. And I can't tell you, that is like riding on the most fantastic roller coaster that I've ever experienced. It's a wonderful feeling. And the truth is, it is corrupted, but for the Chinese, it is a terrible feeling, because it is like a roller coaster which has just left your stomach behind, because that means they can't get. Selling pharmaceuticals depends on confidence from the international medical community. And if that confidence is not there, they can't move forward. So I would say the Chinese are very stuck. And they're stuck between this Marxist belief that they must eradicate a problem completely, and probably some very young doctors, which are very idealistic in China. And that is a battle for China's soul. But the problem is that even the young doctors have not accepted the one simple fact. You cannot go forward without dealing with the past. I don't care if China stopped this tomorrow. To some extent, even getting away, even if China wasn't still doing it. Why in my life should I give up this struggle? This is the struggle for the soul of China. They need to accept what they've done. They need to come to terms with the families. These are the only people who have the moral high ground in this whole issue, are the families with missing people. Not me. Not Falun Gong, not Uyghurs, not Uyghur leaders, none of that. Certainly not the Transplantation Society, okay? The families. It all comes down to that. And right now, we can't hear from those families. We can't interview them. They'd be scared to talk to me. They'd be scared to talk to anybody. So when that happens, that we can talk to those families, that's when we know this problem, that we know things have shifted.
Okay, our time is up. Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it.
Wow,
Thank you.
great interview.